Welcome to the COBB Intake System install guide for the Focus ST. You'll need the following tools: a 7, 8, and 10mm socket and 12mm deep socket, ratchet and extension, a 7 and 8mm box wrench, a T30 Torx driver, panel popper, flathead, pliers, and silicone spray. You should have a COBB intake tube, a 3-inch silicone reducer and 3-inch elbow, a 6mm socket cap screw, and 4 worm clamps. Start by opening the hood. Gently remove the engine cover by pulling up on the 4 corners. Now remove the T30 Torx screw on each side of the cowl. Then remove the 4 plastic retainers securing the cowl. It's easier to get at the retainers by the cowl grills after pulling back the weather stripping. Remove the cowl grill on each side by gently prying it free. Then remove the 10mm bolt on each side of the cowl that was hidden under the grill. Slide the inner cowl panel out, and then disconnect the sound Symposer tube from the cowl panel. Remove the inner cowl panel and set it aside. You can also remove the entire cowl by removing the windshield wipers. We found doing it this way was easier for our application. Remove the battery cover for better access. Loosen the 7mm intake clamp. Be careful not to touch the battery. Remove the 8mm bolt securing the intake midsection. Loosen the 7mm intake clamp on the other end of the tube. Remove the intake midsection and set it aside. Disconnect the intake breather hose. Remove the 8mm bolt securing the intake tube. Using a deep socket, remove the 12mm ball stud the engine cover mounts to. You'll need to loosen the clamp at the intercooler inlet using a 7mm box wrench. A ratcheting wrench is great to have here. After loosening the clamp, you can now remove the intake tube. Slide a worm clamp onto the COBB 3-inch reducer coupling, then install the reducer in place of the intake tube. Now loosen the Airbox elbow worm clamp. Then remove the intake elbow. Lubricate the outer ends of the COBB intake tube with silicone spray to make it easier to slide it into the silicone couplers. Slide a worm clamp onto the COBB intake tube. Then seat the COBB intake tube into the reducer coupler. Now we'll slide 2 COBB worm clamps onto the COBB elbow. Connect the airbox to the COBB intake tube using the 3-inch silicone elbow. Don't tighten the worm clamps fully yet to allow room for adjustments during the install. Install the spacer under the intake mount. You'll need to install this spacer to ensure adequate clearance. Take a look at how close the intake comes to the fuel line. For clearance, we use the supplied washer and the OEM 8mm bolt to secure the intake tube for our application. Tighten the two intake elbow worm clamps. The OEM worm clamps are 7mm and the COBB units are 8mm. Tighten the 8mm worm clamp on the reducer coupling. Pro tip, add the OEM rubber grommet from the intake tube onto the 12mm ball stud for a cleaner install. Reinstall the 12mm ball stud used to mount the engine cover. Connect the breather tube to the COBB intake. Use a hose clamp or a zip tie to secure the breather tube. Loosen the 4 10mm bolts securing the airbox lid. Remove the airbox lid. Remove the OEM filter. Install the COBB Air Filter. Be sure the filter is seated behind the airbox lip as shown. Replace the airbox lid. Tighten the 4 10mm airbox bolts. Slide the cowl panel in and then reinstall the sound Symposer tube. Then guide the inner cowl back into place. Reinstall the two 10mm cowl panel bolts. Reinstall the 4 plastic retainers that secure the cowl. Reinstall the 2 T30 Torx screws that secure the ends of the cowl. Secure the cowl Weatherstrip. Snap the cowl grills back into place. Replace the battery cover. Replace the engine cover. Then just close the hood and you're done. With your COBB intake system, you'll feel the power come on earlier and notice an improvement in power and torque across the rev band. Combine this with a tuner intercooler for greater gains. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.